My name is Marcel Serzin. I'm the BCD Technical Sales Manager. I've been with BCD Software for over 8 years. Currently the Technical Sales Manager, but previously I was the Technical Support Supervisor. Our key technical presenter today is Mark Alonso, our Catapult Support Specialist here at BCD Software. Mark's been with BCD for over 4 years now and works closely with our lead Catapult developers and is involved in product direction for Catapult. At any time throughout today's webinar, you can ask questions by just typing in the bottom right corner of the GoToWebinar window. Just type your questions in there. We do have people on standby to answer your questions. Now, today what you're going to see is how easy it is to automate your report distribution with Catapult. What Catapult does is it delivers reports reliably to people in the format that they want, whether they want it as a PDF, Word, or maybe they want it as email or printed to them. You can do all of that within Catapult, and it's all automated. There's really two purposes to today's webinar. For people who have already downloaded, this will show you how to work with the tool, give you a better idea of the Catapult console and the Polar and how it all works. And for those of you who have not downloaded yet, it's about a 50-50 split attending today's webinar. This will show you what Catapult is as well as the ease of use. This is a technical webinar, but it will serve both purposes. This webinar is scheduled to last 60 minutes. We'll leave about 5 minutes at the end for some questions and answers. After the webinar, you can always go to bcdsoftware.com and download a free trial and see how it works on your system, and you'll see how easy it is to actually download and get it set up, which would take less than an hour to do. So the agenda we're following today is I am going to start with an overview of what Catapult is, and then I'm going to pass it over to Mark, who's going to do some live demonstrations of how to email a report and save it, as well as how to split a report. So you can split a report by page or taking a specific section out of a report. We're also going to cover more of a high-level overview, but how to take a report and convert it to a spreadsheet. And along the same lines, a high-level overview of the option of taking a report and web archiving it. So what is Catapult? Once again, Catapult is an automated report and document distribution tool. You can take a spool file or a PC file. Here's an example of a spool file. So you can have a spool file like this, have it automatically transformed by Catapult as a Word document, PDF, HTML, or as a spreadsheet. You can then have the choice of how you want to distribute it: email, fax, print, archiving to your network. And you also have the choice of who receives these reports. You can send it to an individual person, you can send it to a group of people, or if you're doing the split, or what is sometimes referred to as parsing, you could have one page go to one person, another page go to another person. So you have very flexible distribution options. The other distribution option is to send it to the Nexus portal for web archiving. So users can log into a secure web portal, see their reports in a folder tree structure like you see on your left, and this is all based on authorities. Users will only see the reports that they are authorized to. It's important to understand how Catapult works at a high level before I pass it over to Mark, so I'm going to focus on that. When you download Catapult, there's 3 components. There's the Catapult console, which is where you define which spool files will be distributed. There's the Catapult Polar that actually handles the distribution itself and the conversion to a PC file format. And then there is Exodus. Exodus is a subsystem included in the download, and that's what handles the communication between the console and your iSeries, looking for the spool files, or downloading those spool files onto the PC with the Polar, which then processes them. So there's a little bit more of a breakdown. The Catapult console, so you would have this installed on your PC. This is where you create the grab rules. So a grab rule is telling Catapult which spool files to grab and how to process it. So you can have as many grab rules as you want. And the other thing about the console, it's also where you manage your grab rules. So you can have them sorted into folders. You might have it by department, like accounting, or by employee. So you have that flexibility there. And from the console, you can also monitor the polar status. So what is the polar? The polar is what handles the processing, as I mentioned earlier. So normally you're going to have this on a PC, like a server that's running 24/7 or however long you need Catapult to be running. And what the polar does is it pulls the output queues that you select through the configuration to look for spool files. You set an interval, let's say every 10 to 15 minutes, and it will look for a match based on what you defined in the grab rule in the console. The polar then processes the spool file. So what it does is it takes a spool file, downloads it as a text file onto the PC that has the polar running. So that removes the resources and puts that onto the PC instead of the iSeries. So it does all the transformations to different PC file formats, and then it distributes the documents. So that's what the polar does. So before I pass it to Mark here, and we'll get on with the technical part of this presentation, I'm just going to do our first polling question today. And what is your organization's main reason for needing automated report distribution? In today's economy, a lot of people are looking at reducing costs. So is it reducing printing and mailing costs, reducing demands on the IT department? That's where the automated processing comes in. Improving customer service. So the other thing you do with Catapult is, you can deliver invoices or billing immediately, but email instead of like snail mail. And the one that I always find funny still is a lot of people rekey information to spreadsheets. So Catapult can also eliminate that. So what is your main need here? And Mark, I'm going to make you the presenter now, and I'll pass it over to you right after we see what the results here of the poll. Okay, so we've got a lot of people have already voted. I'm going to close the poll and just share the results with everybody. So a lot of people, 60%, are looking at reducing printing and mailing costs and then reduce demands on the IT department. All of these are some of the benefits of Catapult. So we are now going to move on to the technical part of this presentation. Mark, we can see your screen now. You are the presenter. Okay, I can see your PowerPoint, and I can't hear you yet. Okay, Mark, we still can't hear you. We can see your PowerPoint, but I'm not getting any audio.
Okay.
There we go. We can hear you now, Mark.
All right. Thanks, Marcel. So to begin with, we're going to start by creating a rule that's going to be both emailing and saving a spool file to a location on the Polar PC and emailing it to a user. Now, in order to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to first create a grab rule. And what a grab rule is it's a structure you create within Catapult that tells Catapult how to process a spool file. So you'll tell Catapult to download a specific spool file by specifying the spool file's attributes. Tell it what to transform the spool file into. In this case, we're going to transform it to a PDF and then distribute it. So we're going to email it and archive it. Now to launch Catapult, I'm using a launch pad where I right-click and select Launch Console. It then prompts me to log in to the iSeries, and using my iSeries profile password, I then have access to the Catapult console. And as Marcel mentioned,
I'm going to just cut you off here for a second. I forgot to mention something in the intro. Mark is using version 7 of Catapult. If anybody downloaded Catapult prior to, let's say, May 1st, you might be on version 6. So we are using the latest version of Catapult, just in case you're wondering why you're not seeing the version or something different than what you currently have. So this is a version 7 webinar.
Yeah. So this is the new version 7, and the interface will be different if you are on version 6 at the moment. The interface will be different, and the layout of the grab rule and console will also be different. One thing you'll notice if you are in version 6 right now, version 7 is a lot faster. So when I click on the trigger pull, you might notice that it's almost instantaneous. It's incredibly fast. So In the console, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on File, New Role, and this allows me to create a new role. And this is the new rule wizard where you define or tell Catapult how to process a spool file. So we'll give this a description. We'll call this inventory grab role. We could select which folder to place this role into. So the console does have a folder structure where you can organize your rules. And I'll place it into the walkthrough webinar folder. And this inactive status will allow you to toggle the rule active or inactive. So the rule can be processed or ignored based on whether it's active or not. Clicking on the Next button tells us or brings us to the acquisition category. And acquisition is where we decide if we want to grab a spool file or a network file. So Catapult isn't only limited to spool files, it also allows you to grab network files. So any network files that need to be distributed can be distributed. We'll select iSeries spool file and click Next to bring us to the spool file acquisition. So here's where we specify which spool file we want. These fields are basically the spool file's attributes. We populate these fields with the attributes of the spool file that we want to process. If we don't know what those attributes are offhand, there is a Locate button which launches the spool file selection window. From here, there's the Queue drop-down box that we can click on, and it loads a list of queues on the 400. Now notice there's grayed out entries and bolded entries. The grayed entries are entries that Catapult is ignoring. The bolded entries are the entries that Catapult will be looking at. So Catapult actually looks at specific out queues. This is to increase the performance of the Catapult so it doesn't look at every single out queue. So we're going to go to the QPrint2 out queue and then click on the Filter button. And what that does is loads the spool files within that out queue. You can double-click on any spool file within the out queue to view the spool file and verify that's the file you want. So just previewing this file. This is the file we want. And you could either hit Select to select that file or hit Cancel, right-click, and select File. So both options work the same. From here, notice it imports all the information of that spool file into our selection criteria. You could generalize that selection criteria by blanking out any of these fields. For example, if different users generate the same spool file, you could blank out the user ID. Different jobs generate that spool file, you could blank out the job name. So you could blank out as many of those attributes as you want and generalize the selection. There's different options on this page. You could select a range. The CCS IDs allows you to specify different CCS IDs if you're using international spool files or have different languages. Now clicking on Next brings us to document splitting, which I'll cover in the next section. Data extraction is where you can extract information from within the spool file. You could extract as much information as you want. You could personalize an email being distributed by Catapult by using information from within the spool file. You could combine extracted data within the spool file name to create unique spool file names or, document names. And transformation. Transformation is where we then tell Catapult what file or what format we're going to download the file in. So if I click on the document format drop-down box, these are different formats available to us. There's text, PRN, which is easy pickings. Easy pickings is a report mining tool. We'll cover that once we go over the spreadsheet category. There's Adobe PDF. RTF is basically a Word document, HTML, TIFF, PCL, and other. So what I'll do is I'll select PDF, and if you notice, there's different options underneath the transformation category. Some are grayed out and some aren't. Depending on what format I download the file in, these options will become available. So text has a limited number of options. However, PDF has all these options available to it. So I'll select PDF, and with the options enabled, I can then also specify the file name. The file name currently uses &n, and &n is a replacement value. Catapult uses replacement values throughout the grab role, or allows you to use it throughout your grab role. And &n is a replacement value for the spool file name. So we have replacement values for different spool file attributes, and our user's guide actually lists the different values available to us. So I'm just going to drag over to user's guide, and here's a list of the values that we have and that you could use in combination with a spool file name. So you could have the system date, system time to uniquely identify your spool files. Now I'll just drag this out of the way. Okay, and I'll just remove & at this point. What I'll do is I'll just hardcode inventory category as the file name, and I'll put the system date, $y, and append that to the file name. So with transformation, or with PDF selected, we could then look at the different options available to us. There's document setup, allowing us to override the page defaults. This is handy if you're applying an overlay, and an overlay is basically an image you can place behind your spool file text. So you could have an invoice where you could have your spool file text laid out on top of an invoice graphic. You could also override the fonts and the font sizes and use your own fonts and font sizes. Bookmarking allows you to create links to different chapters or sections in your document. There's a default PDF options where you could compress the text and images, as well as further secure the image or secure the information with encryption. And here's the overlay option. We do have different options available to us. A title and footer page allows you to include a title, which could be an introduction, and a footer, which could be a disclaimer to the report, and easy pickings, which we'll cover in the next section, and compression, which allows you to compress the file. Finally, we get to distribution, where we then tell Catapult how we're going to distribute the file. So what we're going to do is we're going to email. So enable the base document emailing. I'll enter the address that the email is going to go to. Pardon me. And enter a subject. And there's different options available to us for emailing. General options, we could have an attachment, a link if we're downloading the file, and also include a header and footer, which is also could be used as an introduction and as a disclaimer within the email. We'll go to archiving, where we'll enable archiving, set a location of where we're going to save the file. Now I'm using C:/. What that is it's relative to the polar PC. So even though I'm working on the rule on this PC, the polar could be on a remote PC, and this path is going to be relative to that remote PC. So this is the location I'll be saving it to. And then I'll click OK. So this is a warning prompt again, mentioning that because it's going to be relative to the remote PC, a UNC path is recommended. Just click yes, and here's our rule. So by default, it's set to inactive. I'll activate the rule, and click on this green button to toggle an immediate poll. The polar polls every 10 minutes by default. You could change that value to 5 or 15 minutes, or to however you want. If you don't want to wait for that poll to be triggered, you can trigger one yourself. So I'll trigger one now. And this is the polar status window. If you notice it flashed, that's the polar running and processing that spool file. There's a requests and errors list, which shows us the file has been completed. Expanding this list shows us what the rule has done. It's converted it to a PDF, it's emailed it, and it saved it. So now if I go into my inbox, let me just drag over my inbox window here. There is an email from Catapult, and here's a spool file, and notice the spool file's inventory category with a system date appended to it. And here it is in PDF format. Close out of that. And let me connect to the remote PC where the Polar is running. And I'll drag the window over. I'll just connect to the PC here. And this is the webinar folder where I've saved that file to. And here it is, where I could then launch it. And there's my file. So we've just created a rule that both emails and archives the file to a location on the Polar PC. Now feel free to ask any questions if you have any questions, or let me know if I'm going too fast. Okay? I'm just going to toggle over my PowerPoint slides. So we've emailed and saved. The next step on the agenda is to split a report. So that's a request that comes up quite a bit, is taking a large spool file and bursting it into separate segments, which then can be distributed to different users. So the steps taken to, or the steps you'll need to take to create a rule that splits a report is to define each segment. So you have to tell Catapult what each segment, where each segment starts and ends. You'll then need to define how to differentiate each segment, what the anchor is. An anchor is what Catapult will use to then find a value to uniquely identify each segment. And then you could use a distribution group. A distribution group associates that key value, or that unique value, to an email address, printer, so on. So let me toggle back over to Catapult, to the console. And we'll go back to the rule that we just created. Double-clicking on it brings up the rule editor. And we'll process the same spool file. Let me just launch the spool file so that we can take a closer look at it. And if we review the file, we'll notice that there's an inventory category here of amps. Go to the next page. Continues as amps. Then it changes to banjo on page 4. And then to bass on page 5. So what we'll do is we'll split this report using inventory category as the value to uniquely identify each segment. So just looking at the report, it looks like each segment is limited to about 1 page. So bass, for example, is 1 page long. So is banjo, while amps could be multiple pages. That allows us to specify a segment start and end of a page, as at least 1 page. Now, let me hit cancel here. I'll just close out here. And we'll go down to document splitting and enable that option and click on next. So our segment start is going to be start of page, and our segment end is going to be end of page, because that is the size of the smallest segment. We could then click on View Document here, where we could define the key anchor. In this case, we'll use the text category. And the key value, in this case, we'll use amps. So Catapult is going to go through a report, find the key anchor, and then relative to this anchor, it's going to find the key value. It's going to do that for every segment, and each segment is going to be a page long. Click OK. There we go. So it's imported that information for us. And now we can select or specify our distribution group. Now just to back up a bit, the way Catapult works is once you've specified the size of the segments, Catapult will go through each segment, grab the key value, go to the next segment, and grab the key value from that. Compare the values. If they are the same, then it knows it's still the same segment. Goes on to the third segment, does the same, compares the value or key value with the previous key value. If that key value changes, it then splits out that segment and starts a new one. So the previous segment could be 2 pages long, and the new segment could be 1 page long. Now for distribution groups, I'll just click on this Browse button here. And that launches our distribution group window. Currently I only have one distribution group. But if I right-click and edit the group, we can see what the contents of that group is. Now I have 2 entries. This is a group entry for the amps and banjo values. And what that does is whenever the key value amps or banjo is encountered, it'll email it to these 2 email addresses. So notice you could have multiple key values with multiple email addresses. Another instance is the guitar group, where whenever the guitar value is encountered, it'll email it to this email address. So I'll click OK, and I will select this group, and click on Next. The next step is to define where the unassigned segments are going to go. So there may be a point where a new segment's created with a new value that Catapult doesn't have a distribution or a group entry for. So what you can do is you can specify an email address where that segment will go to in the event that happens, so that later on you can forward it to the specific user that that segment should go to. In this case, I'm going to select Don't Process, but that option is available. Now I'll go down to Transformation. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the file name and include &k. &k is a replacement value for the key value. This way we can identify what the file or what segment we're looking at just by looking at the file name. I'll then go down to the email category. And notice there's another tab here for split documents. The base document tab emails the entire document. The split document tab is for the split. I'll disable the enable base document emailing. Go to the split documents tab and enable that. From here I can then specify where I'm going to email or what I'm going to use as my email address source. You can specify a hard-coded value, or you could use groups. Now this grabs the group that is specified back in the splitting category. Also notice there is an extracted value option. What that allows you to do is it allows you to extract the email from the actual report as well. So you could grab the email from your spool file text if the email is there and use that as your emailing source or email address source. In the subject, I'll just call it inventory category for &k as well. And the same options apply for split documents. So we could send it as an attachment or as a link, and we have the header and footer options. Then go to archiving, which I had enabled before, and I'll just uncheck this option. And notice it's the same as emailing in that I have 2 tabs for base and split. So that's basically it for the rule. What this rule is going to do, download the same spool file, go through the different segments, split out the segments, and then distribute it based on the distribution group. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And now, because I've run this rule before, I'm going to have to go into the history list and delete that entry. Now Catapult maintains a history list, and the history list is where Catapult knows which spool files and grab rules have been processed. This allows Catapult to avoid reprocessing or redistributing a file that's already processed. So because we've processed that rule, we're going to have to delete it, and the rule number in column 2 is the rule number 13. We'll delete the entry for rule number 13 and click on the green button to toggle an immediate pull. There you go. And let's just go to the request list, refresh. It says it's completed. If I expand the entry in the request list, it shows us which emails have been sent, which segments have been processed. And it's basically a breakdown of what the rules completed.
And just to clarify that last point there a little bit, Mark, too, the history list, that is not something you're ever going to have to do once your rule is in production. Once you set up the rule how you want it to, you'll never have to go and delete the history list. It's only really when you're doing development like what we're doing now, we're doing different things to that rule until we get it to the point where it's doing what we want it to. Once you got it there, you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, exactly. It's because we're modifying the rule, it's mostly for testing purposes where you delete that entry. As Marcel mentioned, it's something you'll never actually have to touch unless you want to rerun the same rule or reprocess the same spool file. And drag over my inbox, click send receive. There we go. So we have 3 emails. Here's the guitar, and notice $K was replaced by the key value. And notice when I open the file, it only has the guitar section, or guitar segment. This includes 2 attachments, both amps and banjo. And notice it's only the amps section. And banjo is only the banjo section, which is 1 page. Both email addresses, Mark A and M. Alonzo, were directed to me, so I have 2 copies of the same spool file, or same email. Okay. And let me just drag this window out of the way. And let's go back to our PowerPoint slides.
And Mark, before we cover the next session on spreadsheets, if you could just maybe touch on the call-out program really briefly for people that don't have the email address in the report, or they don't want to define it in the rule, or they actually want to grab the email address from an existing DB2 file.
Okay. Let me just toggle back to Catapult. And the call-out option is underneath the data extraction. So what the call-out option is, we've actually changed it to the external data values, is it allows you to call a program on the iSeries. And one of the main uses for that is if you already have a physical file that contains the email addresses with the associated key values, you don't want to create another distribution group within Catapult and have to maintain that along with a physical file. So this option allows you to create a program on the iSeries that does a lookup to that physical file. It passes, or Catapult passes the key value to that program. The program uses it as a lookup, which in the file, it finds the email address that then is passed back to the program and passed back to Catapult. So enabling this option, you specify the library that that file will reside, or that program will reside, and you pass the input parameters. In this case, if we're splitting, $K. The program then returns the email address. It can return up to 10 values, so you could have $B0 all the way through to $B9, which can then be used within your email. In this case, I'll specify user-defined $B0. So for every segment, it calls the program, a lookup's done, and then the email address is returned, and it's used as a distribution.
All right, perfect, Mark. Thanks for covering that. I'm going to switch the presenter back to my screen for the introduction to this next section. And this is on spreadsheets. So we're going to do the next polling question here. And the just to see what you currently do with spreadsheets. So which of the following best describes your current process for delivering spreadsheets to end users? Maybe you currently don't have an existing process. Maybe the requests are just, you get endless requests. It takes a while to do it. Maybe currently you have a manual process in there somewhere. Or maybe you already have an automated process. And then there's some of you maybe that don't have a need for spreadsheets, but we haven't seen too many people in that last category. So go ahead and pick the option that best meets your scenario. And then we're going to cover that, how to do that in Catapult. Okay, so most of the people have voted here. And just so everybody can see what everybody else's process is, 45% of you manual process, and 36%, which is already good, impressive. Maybe some of you already have Catapult as well. You have an automated process, and 9% do not have a need. So we're going to just briefly cover here how you would create spreadsheets in Catapult. To do this in Catapult, you actually need a second component or a second product called Easy Pickens. So Easy Pickens is a data mining and report extraction tool. So you would only need this on the PC that is running the puller. And this is how we extract data from the spool file and convert it to a spreadsheet. So Easy Pickens is also a standalone product. It allows you to analyze data, to do graphs, queries, sorts, and summaries of data, whether it be spool files or text files as well. And it ties in with Catapult to produce the spreadsheet. So I'm just going to pass it right back to Mark, and he's going to go just a high-level overview of what the steps are to create the spreadsheet in Catapult.
All right, thanks, Marcel. And I'll show my screen. So to begin with spreadsheets, as Marcel mentioned, you'll need a third or another product. It's Easy Pickens, a data mining utility, where you first create a model. A model in Easy Pickens is basically a combination of templates and a table and a summary of that table if you want. A template, you can imagine, is similar to a cardboard layout with holes punched through it. And data showing through the holes is the data you're extracting. So in this example, the grayed out blocks of information is information we're extracting to a table. The table can then be exported to Excel, or you could create a summary of the table. Now the summary is totals of certain columns within the table, calculated fields, different views of the table basically. The summary can also be exported to Excel. Now in order to automatically run a Easy Pickens model, what you'll need to do is create a batch file. And a batch file is basically a script file that you specify within or that you create within Windows. It tells the Windows operating system to first launch the Easy Pickens tool or program, to open the model, and again the model is a combination of the template, table, and summary, and then export the information to an Excel spreadsheet. So once you've created that batch file, within your grab rule, you then enter the path to the batch file, the path to the input file, and then the path to the output file. Within the grab rule, you then specify how you're going to distribute that file. You could save it to a specified location, or distribute it via email, print it, and so on.
And one thing that we didn't mention earlier on as well is all of this stuff, a lot of what we're covering today, including how to do the spreadsheet, is all in the Catapult user guide. So this is chapter 7, has a tutorial of exactly how to do what we're showing here. So we're not going to go into any more detail on this today. We just want to give you the 3-step process of how to get it into a spreadsheet. And those Easy Pickens models are reusable if you have spool files with the same layout. So you define it once, and then it's reused within your rule. So I'm just going to take the presenter back here for the next section, which is web archiving. And so you have this option as well within Catapult, and this is to give people web access to reports. And this is what the end user view would look like. They would log into a secure portal, and the portal that we use is our own portal called Nexus Portal. They log in, and based on their authorities, they only see the converted spool files that they are authorized to, and those could be PDFs, as we've already shown you today, HTML, RTFs, and so on. Not only can they see the converted spool files, people can also manually upload their own files if they want. So you can even create documents. So there's much more power than just viewing the spool files that were distributed there. And in anything within the portal, you can have users or groups of users given authority to what we call objects. So the object is either the folder or the file itself. And this is, once again, all automated in Catapult. Based on the polling interval defined in Catapult, it'll grab spool files and distribute them. Another nice feature is you can extract data out of the spool file, and you set that up within Nexus and Catapult. And within the portal itself, there is a search box in the top right corner. So when you search for something, it can search on those extracted data values. So we've seen quite a few uses for extracted data values. They can be in the callout program to be used as an email address to send to, for naming conventions, or for Nexus search values. And just to go into a little bit more detail on Nexus, Nexus is a web portal that is license free. So there's no upfront license fee, just a yearly maintenance fee. And it is a portal that you do not need to know any HTML or do any programming. It's already done for you. So what you get right when you install it is a secure login. That could be against a SystemI profile. Or if the end user does not have a SystemI profile, you can create a profile for them directly within Nexus. You can also add other content. It's not just about documents. You can add links to any web pages or web applications. And there's a bunch of free tools also included in Nexus, like calendars, to-do lists. But we have a recorded webinar on Nexus. I'm not going to get into it too much more than this, other than to say, if you want to do web archiving of reports, this is how, one option anyways, of how you would do it within Catapult. And Nexus does run on your SystemI. And you can have as many sites as you want, maybe one for employees, one for partners, and one for vendors with that single license. So I did mention there's no license fee. There is a yearly maintenance fee, and that's about $3,000, actually under $3,000 for unlimited users, for a single partition, and unlimited sites. Once again, Chapter 8 is where you would find the information on how to do this. But just like we did with the spreadsheets, here's the high-level overview steps that you would take to accomplish this. Within the editor, under distribution, there is a Nexus option. And as I said, you can have multiple Nexus sites with a single license. So you'd have to just tell the grab rule which Nexus site are you going to be distributing this or archiving this report to. Once you've selected that site, once again, you could extract data and search values out of the report. Then you go into Nexus, and in Nexus is where you tell it which folder within the menu tree that you will want the report to go into. You can also do further things like when you're doing a split, you can take one specific split segment and put it into one folder. So there's that flexibility. So once again, just define the ECM folder and then which grab rule criteria it is looking for a match on. And of course, you can specify the authorities, and that is done within the Nexus distribution rule. So the last polling question of the day is on this topic. Do you need to make reports available via a secure website? So yes, most likely, undecided, or no. Do you have a need to do that? And another way to look at a portal as well is, you'll hear this in our Nexus webinars, it's a web desktop. This means that people don't have to be on their PC. They can be on any PC and have access to this information. It's up to you whether you want to allow them to do that externally outside of your firewall or not. So we're just going to share the results once again here. So 27% yes, undecided, and 30% or 36% no. So if you're not part of that 36%, you will want to take a look at Nexus to do that for you. Now, as we wrap up here, this is a good time to start asking more questions. Just type them out. But what we do at the end anyways is we go over what the typical frequently asked questions are, and we go over some kind of tips and techniques here for the last 5 to 10 minutes. So in terms of frequently asked questions about Catapult, so as Mark mentioned, you can poll for not only spool files, but also PC files anywhere on your network that the Polar PC has access to. I know somebody asked this before the webinar, and there are actually CL commands included with Catapult. So one of them is called zrun rule. The other one is zdistribute spool file. This is very, very handy in situations like the following. Let's say you have somebody that has a green screen report, maybe a prompt program. They put in their information, they hit enter, and it generates the report. We mentioned earlier that Catapult runs on a polling cycle every 10, 15 minutes. That's usually what we recommend. The lower that number goes, the more processing it does. If you have it set to every minute, it'll just be running continuously. So in those cases where you have an immediate demand, almost like more like on-demand distribution, you would take the CL command and embed it in your report program somewhere. So the minute that they hit enter and the report is generated, as soon as that spool file is created, Catapult gets triggered. That rule runs immediately, so within that next 10 to 15 seconds, let's say it's an email is specified, they will get the email right away. So very handy commands in there. Once again, those are in our documentation. And you can also pull more than one iSeries. So with the one Polar, you can hit multiple iSeries, but not only that, in Catapult, you can have multiple environments on the same system. So that's always handy as well. Sometimes you might have a test and a production or have it split up differently as well. So that is possible. And you can pull as many output queues as you want. And this is where we're kind of starting to get into the tips part of it, is remember, a polling cycle in Catapult, it'll look for the grab rule information that you specify in an individual grab rule and compare that against a spool file in any of the output queues that you have selected. So if you select all your output queues, you can imagine that can get pretty intensive. So just make sure to only select the queues that you know you need to pull. So some of the other tips, if you run a grab rule, nothing happens. Often, more so with version 6 in Catapult, it was because you didn't have the output queue selected. In version 7, we've taken some steps to gray out those output queues if they're not selected. The other thing that we see sometimes is people don't use the locate button to select a spool file. They just type in the name, so they might just have a typo or something like that. We do, of course, have debugging features within Catapult to tell you why it did not meet a match or didn't find it. We've already talked about the queue selection. Sometimes people will want to pull or save a report somewhere on the network. So you got to make sure that, or always keep in mind that it's the Polar PC that's the key component here. That's where all the processing happens. That's where it's doing the printing. That's where it's archiving it to your network. So whatever user the Polar is started with, you got to make sure that has authority to do whatever you need processed. Here's another example of it. When you're doing an email, sometimes you get an email relaying error, and that's because the Polar PC is not specified as a trusted IP. We often see this more when people are running Catapult and then they decide to move the Polar to another server, and that new PC is not a trusted IP. So we have seen that as well. All of this information is also found in our knowledge base. One other note about emailing, you can specify any email server to distribute your spool files. It doesn't have to be your IBM I, your iSeries. You can specify any other email server to handle that for you. And another last point is on printing. If you're doing printing, and especially if you're printing PDF, we strongly recommend using Foxit, which is a PDF reader, instead of Adobe. We found just a few bugs to do with just Adobe itself, nothing to do with Catapult, on how it opens and closes PDF documents when it's done as a print too. Foxit works much better. So that's a free download as well as a PDF reader. And the 10,061 error, you just got to make sure that the Exodus subsystem is always running when you're using Catapult. That's what handles the communication between the iSeries and the PC components, both the console and the Polar. So here's some next steps. Once again, this is a great time to be submitting questions in. You could download a free trial if you haven't already at bcdsoftware.com. Everything that we covered today is in the user guide. We have very detailed tutorial chapters. We ship reports, or a program that will create the reports for you. So it's very easy to walk through these tutorial chapters. And our knowledge base on our public website is more for troubleshooting. If you get an error of some sort, you can find it there. And we do also do webinars for other products. We just did Nexus last week, so there's a recording of that one. So just to summarize, Catapult, it's automated report and document distribution. It'll reduce your IT dependency. You set it up once and then you start getting their reports automatically. And it's very flexible in terms of your transformation options, PDF, Word, Excel, and then how you want to distribute those as well. So we're going to take a look at the questions here. I know there was a few that I saw come up earlier that I wanted to address. We have been answering every single question through text as they come in. So we're just going to take a few of the key ones that are worth sharing here. Is the Polar, this is from George, is the Polar on the user's PC, or is there a dedicated server for the Polar? Once you go in production with Catapult after your evaluation period, it will be on a dedicated server. That could have other things on it, but you'll be using it on a PC that is used as a server. You want it to be running 24/7 in most cases. You do have the ability to schedule when Catapult ends and when it restarts. So let's say you're doing a backup every night, midnight till 3 in the morning. You could have Catapult stop before that time and then restart, say, at 4 in the morning. But during your evaluation period, you can use your own PC as the Polar as well. Can you email a link to the report? Yeah, you can do that. We are doing a recording of this presentation, so you'll get an automated email tomorrow with a link to it. Here's a question from Bruce. And Mark, maybe you can answer this one just to also explain the difference between version 6 and version 7. And the question is, does the Polar run as a service?
Okay, yeah. The Polar does run as a service, and that's a big difference between the previous version of Catapult and the current version, version 7. We've changed the Polar to always run as a service in version 7. Prior to that, we used to have the option of running the Polar as either a service or an application. But we found that it does encounter a number of authority issues depending on your operating system and your network security and the profile you're running the Polar as. So by reducing that, by simply running as a service, it reduces the number of authority issues that will arise, and it also simplifies that process. So Catapult's Polar will always run as a service from version 7 onward.
Great. And this can be the last question here. We'll just wrap up about 5 minutes early. Like I said, we have answered all these questions through the text. These are just the ones that we find are worth sharing. The last question, not the pricing one. Anybody has pricing questions? When you exit the survey, there's a question in the survey that says, do you want a price quote? You can just enter it in at that time, and we'll follow up in the next couple of days. But the last question that just came in is, when archiving documents, can the folder name and file name be dynamically created using the key values? Yeah, it definitely can. So those extracted data values, we call them, you can use anywhere from your directory name within the rule where you're going to archive it to your network, the email subject, and many other places. So those can be used throughout, and there is no limit on how many values you can extract, where there was a limit in version 6. So well, thank you very much, everybody, once again, for taking the time to attend today's webinar. Thank you, Mark, for an excellent technical presentation. Like I said, when you leave this webinar, there is a survey. We do appreciate if you could take a couple of minutes just to fill out the 6 very short questions. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, Marcel. Thanks, everybody.